Together with me, I have George Pepou. George is a co-founder and CEO of Val Foods, and we'll be talking about alternative proteins. But before that, I'd like to also say that he is a corrupted chef. You started, I believe, in the food world as a chef.
Yes, I did.
What happened?
You know what? The hours are a lot better as an entrepreneur.
I can only imagine. Well, take it away, and thanks for coming.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me. First up, given I've been asked several times already today, yes, I do look exactly like Formula One driver Daniel Ricciardo. I just thought I'd tear that Band-Aid off before we get into it. Quick question. I'd be curious, who's in the audience? Just raise your hand if you're a chef. Anyone in front of house? You can't be both. You only get to raise your hand one side. Anyone other stuff in hospitality? What do the rest of you do? I guess that'll be a mystery for later. Cool. So today we've heard a lot about the history and culture that underpins the food we eat and about looking to the past. I'm the weird meat guy, and I'm going to be talking about all the really weird shit that's coming in the future. So please bear with me. Most of you are going to think I'm insane or an idiot, but a few of you are going to be feeling very smug in about 5 years when it turns out I'm directionally right on where the stuff is going, so hold on to that. It's late in the afternoon. I figured let's get real spicy with it. So I've started my career as a chef. The hours sucked and I was not very good at it, and so I quit. And since then I spent my whole career working on the future of food and how do you build a food system that is socially equitable and produces really high quality food. That is a really hard topic, but about 5 years ago it became really apparent there's this one issue, this one kind of core systemic issue in food that there really is no credible pathway to resolving. We have a huge bottleneck of agriculture that goes into producing meat. That basically we take a bunch of farmland, we turn that into broadacre crops, and then we feed that into animals. And meat consumption keeps going up. And so we're basically at this point now where we have three options ahead of us. Option number one is persuade about 1 billion people to turn vegan. Does anyone want to volunteer for option one? Cool, I didn't think so. I actually was thinking about getting that neck tattoo from the previous one. No, I'm not a vegan, I eat meat, I think meat's fantastic. Second option is to accept a continued expansion of factory farming. Has anyone heard of the pig hotels, which are now being built in China? A few of you have. Basically up to 36-story buildings where they're producing pork, and it's being sort of presented as this wonderful new solution to meeting the growing demand for meat. So that's kind of option B, that we use multi-story buildings to grow animals, and that is one way to feed the demand. Or the third option is find a way to make something which people that love eating meat choose, that uses a fraction of the land required to produce that protein. We heard a little bit about shrimp farming earlier. It's a very similar logic. Use a very small amount of land to produce a large amount of output, and do that across a bunch of different things that allow us to produce a lot of protein in a very small physical footprint. So before I get into it, has anyone heard of cultured meat? A few of you? Good, that's not bad. So essentially what cultured meat is the using animal cells directly to grow meat. So if you think about a steak that lands on your plate in a restaurant, it's mostly muscle, fat, and connective tissue. To make cultured meat, all you do is you just take those same cells, the ones that repair muscle, fat, and connective tissue, and you put them in all the nutrients they need to grow outside of the animal in an extremely clean environment. Let them grow, harvest them, package it, boom, done, simple. It's just that easy. Anyone can do it with a few $1 million and a bunch of scientists. What this looks like is this. So this is Factory 1 at Vow in Sydney, Australia. This is a 2,000 litre cultivator where we're currently, right now it's growing back in Sydney. And that whole facility fits on roughly the size of this stage and produces several hundred kilos of meat every single month. And we've been operating that now for nearly a year and a half. So you can take a very, very small physical footprint and produce a reasonably large volume of animal protein that is biologically the same as meat that comes from that species, which I think is pretty cool, and hopefully some of you do too. So this is not a new idea. It turns out this has been around for a little while. Winston Churchill said back in the 1930s in an article, 50 years hence we shall escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order to eat just the breast of the wing by growing the parts separately under a suitable medium. So that was back in the 1930s, and obviously the technology took a little bit of time to catch up. But then early in the 2000s, as Dr. Fajada kind of correctly pointed out, this is very handy for space, NASA agrees, and they started looking at growing meat for space travel. And that started off with goldfish, which is an interesting choice. It's like you can grow anything goldfish, cool, whatever, fine. And then in 2013, mad Dutch professor decided to grow a beef burger. This one beef burger cost 300,000 euros, which I presume makes it the most expensive bit of meat in history, which is quite an achievement. And then back in 2020 in Singapore, the first regulatory approval was granted for these chicken nuggets, which made them the most exclusive chicken nuggets in the world, presumably, if you can have an exclusive chicken nugget. And then just a couple of months ago, in the US, 2 companies were approved to start selling cultured chicken products in US restaurants and retail. And so over the course of the last 20 years, this has gone from an idea to something which is now available across 2 continents. And I'm now going to tell you why that is a really, really dumb thing to do. Quick show of hands, who here eats chicken? So both of those companies are making cultured chicken. If you had to guess, how many times do you think you've eaten chicken in your life? Hundreds, thousands maybe? Probably in Singapore, probably thousands at this point. You're an expert in everything that makes chicken. You put a piece of chicken in your mouth and you can tell exactly what that is. You've trained your brain over thousands or hundreds of different meals to know exactly what is and isn't chicken. And what those companies are trying to do is they're trying to make exactly the same thing to trick you into believing you're eating something that was grown in a bird so that you'll eat that instead. And I, as someone that loves eating meat, I've always found that a really strange concept. I don't want to go through this very convoluted path to eat the same thing made in a different way. I would want to eat something which is different, that I'm choosing because it offers me something new as opposed to take something away from me. Kind of see this as the opposite of the non-alcoholic beverage space. I want the presence of something in the food that I eat, not the absence of something. There's no downside to eating chicken, the way there is a downside to drinking a beer. And so instead, what I believe and what I think is a far more interesting question is we now have a tool set that allows us to make any form of meat. We can make any combination of flavor, texture, nutritional profile, and function. If given that opportunity, would we want to make chicken? So we kind of have this blank sheet of paper. We can take any cells on the planet, we can feed those the nutrients they need, and we can make any meat that we want out the other side, which raises a really interesting question. What are the odds that chicken, beef, and pork are the tastiest species on the planet? Would anyone take that bet? No one? So if you look at the history of where meat has come from, about 10,000 years ago, in a couple of different places, the golden guinea fowl and I can't remember the exact name of the species of wild pig, basically wandered into villages, and they turned out they weren't too bad to have around, and so they ended up becoming a companion animal, which then you end up with a lot of, and you need to do something with it, and that was, give or take, the origin of animal agriculture. And that's more or less a habit that we built up, and we bred these animals to be really good at being kept in farms over the last 10,000 years. We now have a way to make food by taking the cells of any animals we want and growing them outside of it. The odds of these animals both being the best to farm and also being the best for cell culture is almost exactly 0. So that raises an interesting question. What are the tastiest animals we could be eating? Does anyone know the story of Charles Darwin and the HMS Beagle? So it turns out that Charles Darwin, the guy which came up with basically theory of evolution and all that, had a much more interesting side gig, which was sailing around the world and eating everything he could get his hands on. If you had to guess, out of the hundreds of animals that Darwin and his friends ate, what would you say the tastiest animal he ever tried was? Tortoise. We've got tortoise over there. Anyone else? Any other guesses? Mouse? You're actually closer. Um, so close. It's called an agouti. It's a sort of knee-high rodent from South America. And out of the hundreds of animals he ate, he said it was by far the tastiest animal he had ever consumed. Tortoise was a favorite, but of British military sailors, don't know why, but it was apparently, tortoise meat is apparently delicious, but very slow growing, very inconvenient to farm. But Charles Darwin basically ate everything, and he said the agouti was the tastiest. And so we kind of had this really interesting little data point here of you can eat these weird and wacky animals and have a really interesting and enjoyable sensory experience. And the other side of this is just purely for my sake as someone that wants to make abundant and cheap food, what's the fastest and easiest thing to grow? We've grown now 50 or so species, and here's just a few bits of data, but turns out that things like chicken and beef are slow growing. And if you want to farm something, if you want to make something cheap and abundant, it needs to be really fast growing. It turns out that in the case of something like warbler, which is a little bird that flies long distances, their cells grow extremely quickly to be able to repair muscle in these very long migratory flights. And it turns out that's a really useful property for someone like us who then wants to make abundant and cheap protein. So that's all a little bit about what cultured meat is, where it's come from, and the really interesting question that I think we have an opportunity to answer, which is we have a chance to design anything we want. What does this then look like in the long term? So I'll kind of give you a little reason why I have been so interested and so engaged on this topic. I'm very lazy. I know that may come as a surprise, but I want to be able to make food for myself, and I want to make food for my friends, which is both delicious and very nutritious. And usually it is a choice between those two things. I want to be able to go to the supermarket and purchase something like a mince that tastes better than beef and has the nutritional profile of salmon, so I can both have a really enjoyable meal but also be really healthy. And that is the reason I founded Vow 4.5 years ago now, and we've spent this time going through all of this very arduous, very long process to get to this point. So what I believe we're going to be looking at 20, 30 years down the line is we're going to be buying meat and protein in retail in supermarkets the way that we buy most products, as branded goods, the way you'd go and buy a breakfast cereal, or I guess cereal prawns, as I learned about at lunch. You're buying purely a brand that connotes the experience, the flavor, and the texture of those goods. So the way that when I say Cheerios to you, to a room full of people here, every single one of you knows exactly what that experience is going to look like. I believe we'll be buying protein in exactly the same way, purchasing a brand where you understand what it will taste like, look like, how you use it in a meal, and why you'd select that. These products are going to have balanced nutrition along with a really delicious sensory experience as a way of getting people that would otherwise be eating animals in that meal to eat something else to satisfy some of this growth without having to build more factory farms. That is the ultimate logic of how all of this comes together to drive a more sustainable overall food system. But, oops, it's so close to working, about half of the time. But that's not where we start. So for us, our approach has always been to start by making things which solve a problem, especially for a lot of the chefs in the room. Something that Peter said earlier today was everyone around us, all the different restaurants have access to the same ingredients. That's something which we can start to offer, something entirely new and entirely different. One of the first things that we're offering really came down to this idea of how do we create something which is really new and different? How do we create a contrast which you just don't find in animal products, where you get this balance of really, really rich, heavy meatiness with that really light, pleasant moorishness that you just want to keep going back for more. And ultimately we found the best way to deliver that was actually cultured quail cells. So cultured cells from Japanese quail, you can get this very dense, heavy, rich gaminess, but also turn it into this really light and delicious range of different foods. And so first thing we're going to be introducing is that cultured quail parfait under the brand Forge. Conveniently, I'm wearing the shirt of that. You can see it here. We actually have been getting really good responses serving it as a brulee. So bit of sugar on top, caramelizing it, and you get this really intense mix of different flavors and textures all at once in one big hit. Sweet, it's savory, it's really fun, and very, very different. If you're keen for a try, come chat with me after. I might be able to hook you up with something in the next few weeks. Here we go. And so we've been spending a lot of time in Singapore. We're launching this before the end of this year. We're launching Forge before the end of this year with Parfait first. And we spent some time at the F1 with Mandala Club earlier this year, a couple of, whenever that was, 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's hard to remember how time works. But spent some time with Mandala at their F1 party, served up a bunch of different guests ahead of launch here. And we received some really positive feedback from chefs and consumers alike. It offered this little window that we've been looking for, which is this balance of novelty and nostalgia. The question we asked people before they try is something that I'd like all of you to think about, which was, when was the last time you tasted something for the first time? There's been this really big focus today on the origins of our food and our food culture, and there's absolutely an important, really deeply important part of how we eat and how we think and contextualize food. It's also that novelty and experience is a really important part of how we find new parts of the world and how we contextualize new experiences in our lives. And it's that type of thing, the first time you travel to a foreign country and you tried something wildly different, it's that type of nostalgia that we're trying to capture by offering something which is new and different and exciting to consumers. And so far the feedback, as I said, has been positive, and it takes that novelty and turns it into something really quite thrilling. So yeah, that's basically it. We basically have set out to invent new types of meat for people that would otherwise be eating animal products in those same occasions. And we deliver that by growing cells of animals. And you're going to be seeing this popping up around Singapore over the next couple of months. So that's really it from me. Over to you guys for any questions.
Thank you. Yeah, a few questions have popped up, but it's a new territory, I feel, for everyone, and it's quite fascinating to hear you talk about the prospects of the future. I wonder, as do a lot of people, if there have been nutritional studies like we were talking about, and how does the protein quality compare to the protein quality that we would otherwise get from animals?
So the short answer is yes, many lengthy, very varied nutritional studies. We have a pack of safety data that the food regulators have looked at, which is about, I think we're up to about 1,300 pages of data at this point. So there's a huge amount of different studies. When it comes to nutrients, we think about the macronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, fat, and then micronutrients. Within protein specifically, with the cultured quail, which is what we have the most data on, it is a complete protein with a similar protein quality score using the PDCAAS scoring system that you would find in poultry or other meats. And when it comes to macronutrient breakdown, very, very similar ratio of protein, fat, carbohydrates. When it comes to micronutrients, essentially everything is the same with the exception of B vitamins, which are slightly higher. So about twice the content of B12 and B9.
Well, so in some ways more nutritious with those.
Yes, which was a bit of a funny one. We sort of had this moment of panic of like, oh no, we have too many B vitamins. And we're like, hang on a second, that sounds like a good thing.
And I guess this is a very nice and relevant question, but in theory we then can make any form of meat. If we can have a cell, we can grow it.
Exactly. And more than just any animal, what I think becomes really interesting is you can start to take characteristics of different species and mix them together. So we know, for instance, if you grow crocodile cells, they produce a lot of collagen, which gives a very silky mouthfeel. If you grow alpaca cells, they produce a quite high proportion of iron relative to total production. So you can start to say, okay, well, we want that irony characteristic with that collagen-y characteristic, and
so
mix
like
and match.
turducken, you can make it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow.
And that sounds crazy, but if you look at Italian cooking, pork and veal are mixed so routinely in Italian sauces and meatballs because that combination of flavors is richer, deeper, and more complex and enjoyable.
That's fascinating. Well, thank you very much, George.